Hi everyone! So this is a video I actually started at the same time as the D. Joseph World War I violin we posted last year. They were each supposed to be quick novelty videos about instruments of passing interest. But then if you've seen that other video, you'll know I rabbit holed. I tend to rabbit hole. I definitely rabbit holed here too. But this is one where I was generally a little bit more familiar with the story since it's one I've been told since childhood and involves the history of Taiwan, which is where my mom's family is from. Bet you didn't think you'd be getting some Taiwanese history thrown in the mix here, but hey, I figure whatever I'm interested in, you can get interested in too. So this violin is known as the Green Island Violin, and it's an important part of the Chi Mei Foundation's collection in Taiwan. It was made by Yeh Hsueh-Chun, who was a political prisoner during the White Terror period of Taiwan's history. The instrument itself is super rough. It's made from scrap wood and was carved with a kitchen knife. And the Green Island in the title refers to the prison, a penal colony for the political prisoners during Taiwan's period of martial law. Now it's a tourist attraction called the Green Island White Terror Memorial Park. That's the bare bones of the story, but let me give you a little background, both on Taiwan's history, because it really is quite pertinent, and also on Yeh Hsueh-Chun's personal story.
So this instrument is very important to Taiwan. Actually, this is an instrument, this is called the Green Island Violin. It's made by Yeh Hsueh-Chun. I may be saying this wrong and I apologize. But this instrument was actually made by him when he was a prisoner, when he was a political prisoner. He was imprisoned for 20 years and he did not have any tools or any wood, anything. This is made out of furniture, and he made his own knives by sharpening pieces of wood against each other, and the outcome is, it's an incredible thing that he managed to do this. And again, I don't want to tune it up because I'm afraid of damaging it, but it's really beautiful that this came out of internment and that he was able to create an instrument during his time there. This was a gift also to Chi Mei from the family of Mr. Yeh. So everything was completely handmade. You can even look at the purfling here, just barely whittled in there. But he paid such attention to detail. I mean, look at these F-holes. He actually managed to do that without a real knife. It's incredible. You can look at the pegs too, everything just completely handcrafted. Look at the joining. Okay.
So Taiwan has a long history of being an occupied nation. It was first populated by its indigenous people around 3000 BC, by peoples of Polynesia. The language groups can be traced from Easter Island to Sri Lanka and also even to New Zealand. Visitors tended to be from other Asiatic places, and jade was the regular trade item. At first, it was just the native tribes that lived there, several different ones that encompassed the entire island, and actually I can trace my roots back all the way to some of those tribes, so that's pretty cool. Then in 1624, the occupations began. First the Dutch, then the Spanish in 1626, then the Qing and Manchu dynasties in 1662 and 1683. And this was all based on the sulfur trade. Sulfur was used to make gunpowder, which was, of course, a huge asset. The Dutch and the Spanish made forts in the trading areas, but struggled to keep that trade going. On the other hand, the Aboriginal tribes had been using sulfur for centuries, trading it with other tribes for use in primitive fireworks. Chinese pirates soon figured out that they could profit from this trade, and that idea soon found its way over to the mainland. Actually, here's some pictures of a Dutch fort that's been swallowed up by the banyan trees. It's near where my grandfather lived, so we would visit often when I was a kid. Tainan in the south of Taiwan is where Europeans first landed and made their forts. So this little slice of history got me interested at a very early age. The Europeans called the island Ilha Formosa, which means beautiful island in Portuguese. The Portuguese, incidentally, never actually colonized Taiwan, but were the first Europeans to mark it on their maps in 1542. Anyway, so once the Chinese pirates had figured out the island was useful, it wasn't long before the Chinese Qing dynasty entered into the picture. We're talking from around 1683 to 1895. However, they never maintained entirely effective control over the island, and it was always known as a very troublesome outpost of the Chinese territories. It was useful as a trading port for sugar, camphor, deerskins, jade, timber, and later opium. Officials complained of Taiwan's predilections for a, quote, revolt every 3 years and a full-fledged rebellion every 5. The tribes held their ground in the mountain regions and still continue to this day. By the late 1800s, the Qing dynasty had attempted to modernize Taiwan with the construction of the nation's first telegraph system, bridges, as well as a railway. But they weren't able to hold out. By May 1895, Qing officials finally fled the island, and the Taiwanese briefly proclaimed Taiwan the Republic of Formosa, though the Chinese still technically claimed it as their own territory. It's important to understand that part of why China finally gave up on Taiwan during that time was because of the First Sino-Japanese War, also called the First China-Japan War of 1894 to 1895. This war was held mainly over the influence of Korea and marked the beginning of China's decline and the beginning of Japan's emergence as a major world power. China had gone more than 6 months with a string of unbroken losses during this war and demonstrated spectacularly that the country's attempts to modernize had failed, especially when compared with Japan's successful Meiji Restoration. China was just stretched too thin, and in the Treaty of Shimonoseki of 1895, China ceded sovereignty of Taiwan to Japan in perpetuity. So now we have the Japanese occupying Taiwan from 1895 to 1952. And this is actually the time period when my grandparents were growing up in Tainan. So Japan took it upon themselves to make Taiwan into a model colony, installing both physical and bureaucratic infrastructure and trying to create it in Japan's own image. There are many different sides to this occupation, as there always is, many different points of view. Did Japan create systems for healthcare and education, create faster methods of transportation, and electrify the island? Yes, absolutely. It modernized Taiwan in a very big way, and it probably would have taken the country a lot longer to do by itself. However, the Japanese also worked to suppress traditional culture and language while imposing their own. So it becomes an interesting question of viewpoint and where you were socially during that time. Was Japan good or bad for Taiwan? Or, as it is in retrospect, was the occupation simply just another in a long string of imperialism? For my grandparents, especially my grandmother, Japanese culture was something of a status symbol. Adopting Japanese mannerisms and adhering to the culture meant that you were wealthy enough to rub shoulders with the Japanese. To the day she died, my grandmother preferred to speak in Japanese rather than Taiwanese or Mandarin. When World War II broke out, Taiwan, as a colony of Japan, played a role in Japan's war efforts. And of course, when Japan subsequently lost the war, the Japanese transferred temporary administration of Taiwan to General Chiang Kai-shek at the Allies' bequest. In 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty agreed that the sovereignty of Taiwan was still to be determined. And since then, no other UN treaty or resolution has redefined the status of Taiwan's sovereignty. So who was General Chiang Kai-shek, and why was he backed by the Allies? Well, let's take a look at what was going on in China during that time. We have the Communist Revolution in China that took place in 1949, which basically ousted the previous government, the Republic of China, which was nationalist. The nationalist Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was consequently replaced by the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. This struggle between nationalists and communists dates back to at least 1927 and continued until Mao Zedong's communist forces ultimately won China's government in 1949. Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, which is also called the Kuomintang, KMT, so Chiang Kai-shek's KMT party retreated to Taiwan, where it was backed by the Allies, particularly the US, in an effort to stem the Cold War. So you can start to see why there's so much debate and confusion on what's going on right now between China and Taiwan. China keeps claiming Taiwan. Taiwan maintains it's its own sovereign nation. And it's gone so far down this crazy rabbit hole where China keeps maintaining that Taiwan is still Chinese, that Taiwan has had to maintain their own legal arguments. You ready to hear the exact stances? Because it's nuts. So China says the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, the KMT party, were two different factions in the Chinese Civil War. The Civil War technically never had a legal ending. And since the KMT had control of Taiwan dating back to 1949 and 1950, both governments still belong to the same sovereign country, which is China. So that's China's side. Taiwan says, even though the war never legally ended, and even though the KMT party still exists, it was only ever given temporary jurisdiction over Taiwan by the Allies after World War II. China's last unquestioned power over Taiwan, therefore, dates back to 1895 and the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Make of that what you will. I'm Taiwanese American, so you sure as hell know what my thoughts are, but I do have to make the point, though, of the sheer length of technicalities people are ready to balance their countries on, just for the sake of expansionism and industry. I get it. We all want our countries to be successful, but this feels like it's verging on Lebensraum, and I think we've all had quite enough of that. But back to this violin. Okay, we've done our history. What does this have to do with anything? Well, the bit that I haven't mentioned yet is that once Chiang Kai-shek was forced to retreat to Taiwan, he brought around 2 million refugees with him from China, ranging wildly in status, but leaning toward the educated bureaucratic and political elite, as well as rich industrialists. So the KMT set up camp trying to erase all of Japan's influence and trying to organize Taiwan's people and resources into a way to reclaim China. China now became the main objective, and any Taiwanese that stood in the way of that became political enemies and therefore prisoners. This is the start of the White Terror, when martial law was imposed and so many things changed. The language of the country, for instance, was now officially Mandarin. And God help you if you dared to speak Taiwanese or Japanese in school, because you would be informed upon. This was a period where people would disappear on the tip of a hat, where family and friends informed against each other, where the Taiwanese language was brutally suppressed. It was a terrible time, and many of my family members were directly involved in this. You know the drill with this sort of thing. It's informants, prisons, disappearances, ultimately executions. And it was in one such political prison, the Green Island prison, that this violin was created. So this brings us back to our violin maker, Yeh Hsueh-Chun. Yeh was a student in the geology department at the National Taiwan University during the period of the White Terror. There's not much documentation as to why exactly he was arrested, but most likely it was for something more or less trivial, and he ended up spending 1951 to 1956 in Green Island. Yeh reminisces, quote, "After a typhoon knocked down many of the prison huts, I picked up small wooden boards from window frames and began to carve. From these materials he made both a violin and a guitar, and his friends Chen Menghe and Lin Yichen were able to make music for the prisoners in the very darkest of times." He says, "In that environment of extreme shame and humiliation, appreciating that beautiful collaboration was truly unforgettable." When I was given a chance to look at the instrument, I wasn't even really allowed to play it. It's not that the instrument was in terrible shape or anything. It was just very fragile. It had been cobbled together with scraps by someone in desperate circumstances, reaching for something outside of themselves. Psychologically, putting yourself into this sort of work while you are under extreme duress is perhaps the most pure form of hope you can ever find. If you'll remember the D. Joseph World War I violin I posted earlier this year, there are some serious similarities. It doesn't matter who you are or where you are in the world, humans have a tendency to create, even in the most dire of circumstances. It gives us hope. So it doesn't matter what sort of shape this violin is in. The fact that it simply is good enough. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope the history was interesting and that you were as inspired as I was by the violin. Make sure to subscribe, like, and leave us a comment. Cheers!